welcome. My name's Greg McNab. I'm a partner in the funds group here at Denton's, based in the Toronto office, and I'll be the moderator of our discussion today around Luxembourg. It's my pleasure to introduce my two colleagues who will be leading our discussion today. Maria Rodriguez is joining us here in the Toronto office today for a few days of client visits. So she's literally a few feet away from me today. And we're going to be joined as well by Vincent Quittre, also from our Luxembourg office. Although Maria has temporarily gone back to her Canadian roots for the week, Vincent is joining us from Luxembourg. So both their bios will appear later on, but the highlights are that Maria practices in the investment funds capital markets group in Luxembourg, and mainly focuses on the setup of investment fund structures and associated corporate law aspects. Vincent, on the other hand, practices mainly in direct and indirect tax matters, focusing on Luxembourg for private equity and real estate solutions. So they're, in a way, two halves of the same coin and part of our overall Luxembourg advisory group. So I'll pass it over shortly to Maria, but on the first slide, on both the international transactions and funds spaces, we see Luxembourg float to the top of the list as the kind of one of the top choices for pass-through jurisdictions in structuring these issues. So we're going to hear obviously about the tax efficiency of the jurisdiction, but that's not the only reason. And so, Maria, why don't you take us through kind of this short list of reasons why, Luxembourg makes its way into so many international transactions.
Thank you very much, Greg, and a pleasure to be here, and certainly nice to be home to be able to give this presentation for sure. So indeed, Luxembourg is a very common jurisdiction chosen by clients, especially when they want to enter into the European market. And the rationale for that is it is the largest investment fund center in Europe, boasting around 5 trillion assets under management as of June this year. It's also the second largest in the world following the US, so it becomes a natural choice for, let's say, asset managers or investors who are trying to break into the European market for funds. It is a global hub for cross-border investments. That means that all of the service providers in Luxembourg are quite often used to working with non-Luxembourgish, let's say, nationals, both in terms of investors, but also in terms of asset managers and holding the hand as we go through those processes. Luxembourg also boasts a very stable economy and reputation in terms of political stability, with a AAA rated economy, which I think also allows for these type of businesses and investment funds to really flourish in that market. It's an investor-friendly ecosystem, both from a tax and from a structuring regulatory end. We'll hear a little bit more about that from Vincent a little bit later. And it is a founding member of the European Union, which means we are in the heart of Europe and very closely linked to a lot of the financial markets in Europe. Often it means a 1-hour plane ride away. So that allows us to really benefit from the location. Let's talk a little bit about the Luxembourg Toolbox. So by Luxembourg Toolbox, what we're talking about here is essentially the legal offerings that are available for, let's say, asset managers when they're structuring their investment fund. And Luxembourg really tries to boast as many options as possible in order for clients to essentially find the right fit for them. So this is where we really specialize. And we have 2 different types of products essentially in Luxembourg. One is on the alternative side, which is more geared towards professional investors, but we see opening up a little bit more to, let's say, retail clients. And you have, let's say, a little bit more of a flexible structuring angle. Then you have the UCITS, which everyone has heard about and which Luxembourg is quite traditionally famous for, which is actually aimed at the public. That means more regulation, more protection for investors. But indeed, the market has seen a rise of the alternative investment funds, which is where we really focus our practice. In terms of the structuring angle, what we usually explain to our clients is that in Luxembourg, you can really think of it as let's say, a pyramid of different regulatory angles. So you have the Civil Code of the 1915 law and the AML law, which really provide the basis for a lot of the different structures that we have in Luxembourg. But we also have the infamous product laws, which means an additional legal component, which allows for a flexibility, including, for example, the use of legally segregated compartments for your structures, which allows you to essentially have an unregulated or regulated platform where you can have different compartments for different projects, which are able to really benefit from a variety of investor base, a variety of different assets, and diversification requirements. And lastly, of course, we have the regulatory angle. So the Luxembourg regulator, the CSSF, is very actively involved in developing the investment fund sector in Luxembourg, which means that they also provide a lot of guidance to the market as to how the regulatory angle really comes in. And that means that you have a lot of EU directives and regulations that are imposed on Luxembourg, and the regulator is very actively involved in deciphering those for us, which allows us to essentially be able to speak to clients on a much more comfortable basis, let's say. So perhaps this gives you a little bit of an idea. Very often when we're talking about what vehicle is correct for you in terms of structuring, and this is more aimed at clients, of course, we talk about what type of investors do you want to reach? Do you want to reach professional investors, or do you want to reach retail investors, which then largely varies on which vehicle you're going to choose. Luxembourg also boasts both the regulated structures in the alternative field as well as the unregulated. As we mentioned earlier, the unregulated will of course allow for a higher level of flexibility, which means that you don't have to go to the regulator for the authorization of the vehicle, but also it gives you a lot of flexibility in case of amendments throughout the lifetime of the vehicle itself. Meanwhile, you do have the regulated side, which is very popular with investors who have an investment restriction when they are investing. So for example, if we have an institutional investor that can only invest in a regulated vehicle, we also have those options in Luxembourg. Of course, the regulated vehicles, which means they are directly regulated with the CSSF, are going to take a little bit longer and be a bit more expensive in terms of the setup. Meanwhile, the, let's say, lightly regulated or non-regulated vehicles, there is an indirect regulation always through the AIFM if it is an authorized vehicle. However, you do have a lot more flexibility in how those structures are going to go throughout their lifetime. That means if you need to change the fund documents, if you need to change the structure and timing of those entities, you have a lot of flexibility in that sense. So if we move away from UCITS and the Part 2 UCIs, which also qualify as alternative investment funds, and focus a little bit more on, let's say, the CCAR, the SIF, the RIFE, and the unregulated AIFs. So the CCARs, the SIFs, and the RIFs, these are the product laws that we were talking about earlier. That means that there is an additional level of legal consideration to be done. The CCARs are regulated vehicles, investment funds, that invest in pure risk capital. And that means that there is no diversification requirement, but 100% of your assets are going to qualify as risk capital. And this is limited to a category of well-informed investors, which we'll talk a little bit about just now, which really talks about a different category of investors that really mixes the retail clients as well as the professional investors. And these invest solely, as we said, in assets qualifying as risk capital. So that's always something that we want to take into consideration whenever we are looking at a CCAR. They have access to a variety of different corporate structures and different vehicles that can take the form of a CCAR. A SIF, a very popular vehicle, is a specialized investment fund. This is a regulated entity that is governed by a product law of 2007. And this one requires approval throughout the lifetime of the structure, including at the time of authorization, and has a diversification limitation in terms of the assets that are acquired of 30%, which is quite low, I would say, especially if you have a wide variety of vehicles. And the most important thing I think about the SIFs is that these are really the go-to vehicles when an investor needs a regulated structure that still falls within the alternative scene. Why? Well, it's quite beneficial. There's a lot of investor protection, so investors are very friendly with these vehicles and they know them quite well. But also you benefit from a lot of the different things that the product law brings in. And mostly this is, for example, the ability to create those legally segregated compartments that we talked about earlier, because that means that you essentially, as an asset manager, are able to structure a platform and then have different compartments for different projects, which can take place during a very long lifetime. And then you have the reserved alternative investment funds. So let's call these the superstar of Luxembourg, because since they were introduced in 2016, they have really skyrocketed on the market and they really are the preferred go-to vehicle. The reason for that is that a reserved alternative investment fund can either be CCAR-like, so it can have an investment strategy that invests solely in risk capital and benefit essentially from that type of tax treatment, or it can be a type of specialized investment fund, which means that it will also have that risk diversification that we talked about, but still benefit from all of the regulation that comes in with a SIF. They are limited to well-informed investors. So again, this category, which is a mix of professional investor as well as retail investor, and they are not subject to the approval of the CSSF. So it's really a marriage between a regulated structure and an unregulated structure with all of the benefits that come with that. And of course, a little bit of the strictness that the CSSF imposes. But these are really something that we see that is very preferable on the market. Investors like it. Investors are used to it. Asset managers, they really enjoy it for its level of flexibility and for its ability to essentially meet the needs of different types of platforms for investment. Unregulated AIFs, so these are usually taking the form of partnerships, and those are going to be very, very familiar to investors that are investing in the UK or in the US, as these types of limited partnerships take the usual GP LP structure that a lot of people will already be very used to. And these are essentially not subject to any product law. So you cannot structure these, unfortunately, in the same way with the compartments. And there's no diversification requirements. They're fast, they're easy to set up, it becomes very quick. So I think that's always great. And Greg, did you want to jump in?
No, I wanted to wait till you finish, but then I wanted to ask you a question.
Tell me.
So because so far what you've described is a regime that looks like, as we talked about last week on the global conference, it looks like many other jurisdictions in that there's buckets and categories of different funds. And maybe this is just a Canadian thing, but we find we're constantly being asked, we have similar buckets, obviously, but we're constantly being asked, by clients, is there a way to combine, the good of these two buckets into, can I take advantage of this exemption, but not that? Do you find you have the same conversations there, or are these buckets very clearly laid out and everybody knows where the guide rails are and you just stick within them? And so you pick one and then you stick within it, or do you have that same tug of war as well?
So we do get that question very often, and I think one of the key components of that was really about how do I have investors that fall into this well-informed category being able to essentially enter these types of structures. I'll let Vincent touch upon the different exemptions from a tax perspective or the tax treatment that you would receive for each of these different vehicles, but really. And the truth of the matter is they're extremely flexible. So beyond the CCAR, which has that that requirement to only invest in risk capital, the rest of the vehicles can really invest in a variety of asset classes, which is quite broad. You can have a variety of different legally obligated requirements. So in terms of how much money an investor needs to bring in as its entry ticket, the size of the fund, etc. So you have a lot of already flexibility within each of these different buckets that it allows us to essentially structure different types of asset classes, different types of investor targets, and different types of, let's say, investment strategies in each of these different types of buckets. So the reason why they're so popular is because you have an understanding of each of the buckets, which are differentiated, let's say, with whether or not it's regulated, and secondly, whether or not there is a diversification requirement in terms of risk. And beyond that, everything else can be tailored essentially to each of the different clients that we have. So that makes it very attractive for them because at the level of regulation, let's say it seems as simple. It's a little bit more complicated on the drafting end, but it does seem a little bit more simple, which means it's very client friendly in terms of sale, but also in terms of familiarity. And I think that brings us over to the different types of investors that we had talked about. So you have, for example, retail investors. So these are the type of clients that don't qualify as professional investors. And these are everyone that you see. And for that reason, the European Union has really tried to protect these investors and protect their investment, mostly because the risk that is associated with an investment will very often be, of course, the worst is to lose your investment in whole. But really what they want to do is make sure that there is an understanding of the risk that is associated with the investment. For that reason, we have professional investors, which the definition is of professional client, which comes in from MiFID II. And it really means that these types of investors, whether by nature or because they choose to opt in, they have sufficient, let's say, capital requirements, staffing requirements, and knowledge requirements to be able to really understand the risk that is associated with their investment. Then you have institutional investors. So these are anyone that invests on behalf of others. So think pension plans, think governmental organizations, etc. And what the market has really seen is that there is this requirement to have, let's say, people who are not quite professional investors, but that do have enough, let's say, capital to be able to really invest in these structures and who really want to enter into the alternative sphere. And that's really where the well-informed category becomes a bit more interesting. And this is essentially a retail client that wishes to qualify as a well-informed investor and who meets the requirements and who essentially says that they would like to become a well-informed investor. And so they enter into these structures, and that really talks about how moldable the market actually is to listening to the client requests. And I think what is very interesting about this is we talked about the LPGP structures. So a lot of these investors become limited partners. These are really the most popular vehicles in Luxembourg, GP-LP structures, mostly because they're very familiar for investors. You know, their liability is limited to the amount of their commitment, which means they're very comfortable in terms of how they're investing in. There's a lot of contractual freedom in these types of vehicles because they're contractual entities. So that means that everything is very clear. There's not a huge notarial process. So they're very comfortable with what that looks like in practice. When it comes to the service providers in Luxembourg, which I had mentioned earlier, they're very used to having, let's say, externals come into Luxembourgish markets and essentially try to set up a structure. So that means that you have a full suite of different service providers, and you have quite a few in Luxembourg who are used to the different types of markets. And I'm very proud to say, actually, in terms of service providers, we've also had a lot that are very familiar with different markets. So because Luxembourg is really the jurisdiction for the structure, but maybe not the jurisdiction for the assets or for the investors, a lot of the service providers are very well knowledgeable in terms of languages, in terms of different markets, be it Latin America, North America, be it Europe, or be it outside of that. So really, and we've seen quite an increase also in Asia, etc. So that means that you have a lot of service providers that are going to come and they're going to hold your hand through the process itself of structuring your vehicle in Luxembourg, with the full understanding that there is perhaps a limited presence in Luxembourg that is associated with it. So really what our practice here at Dentons, and especially in Dentons Luxembourg, really focuses on in terms of investment fund structuring is how can we help the client go through all of the different stages of the lifetime of the vehicle. That means that for us, investment fund structuring is extremely important from a tax angle. That really means that the tax structuring guides the ability for us to put together an investment fund structure that really gears towards the upstreaming and downstreaming of funds in this tax-friendly manner, but that also is good for investors that are coming from abroad. From the corporate end, we work a lot with, let's say, specialized vehicles that go underneath the fund structure that hold the assets themselves. And we have a very strong corporate team that is very used to doing these kind of M&A processes. And lastly, we have a very favorable banking package that also allows for investment funds to really pull capital from banks to assist them to get through, let's say, the beginning of the J curve and really entering into the investment process itself. So all of these components come together to allow for the Luxembourgish market to be quite competitive, I would say. And so far, so good. I think one of the very frequent questions that I get from clients is, how do we market our fund? So we have, let's say you already have an investment fund that has been set up in Luxembourg. How do you really sell that? And why is Europe something that is beneficial in terms of selling to different investors? Well, to be honest, one of the most useful tools that you have that have come out at the European level is the ability to access the AFMD marketing passport. That means that the AIFM, or the manager of the fund, is going to have access to being able to sell the fund to different jurisdictions in a regulator to regulator process. That means that you set up your fund in Luxembourg, you have an AIFM, and you say to the AIFM, okay, I think we want to really market our fund in 5 jurisdictions in Europe. And so what will happen is that the AIFM will speak to the CSSF, so the Luxembourg regulator, and the Luxembourg regulator will then speak to all of the different regulators in those countries to essentially allow for you to go into those countries and do your marketing functions. That's very important. It shortens the amount of time, it shortens the amount of costs, and it means that you're able to really sell your fund to a wide access of investors in a very facilitated process. To be honest, it takes around 20 days to process the marketing passport to allow the CSSF to speak to all the different regulators. So it's quite quick in comparison to, for example, if you were to go through a private placement process. So what does that mean in terms of regulation? And I think this is one of the trickier bits. So we have 3 different ways of seeing marketing. So you have marketing of funds in its traditional sense, which means that you're providing investors with documents to the extent that they're able to actually enter into your fund. So that means that final subscription agreements, final PPM, final LPA are being provided to the investors to the point where they can say, okay, I'm ready to enter into this fund. I sign these documents and come in. And this is really where the marketing passport comes in. And at the European level, you have essentially 2 key bodies of work that govern how this is done. So the first one is the AFMD, which allows you to have the marketing passport and establishes the preliminary rules. And we now have the cross-border directive regulation as well. So it's an entire package of different laws which tell you how you can do that. What kind of information should you provide to investors? What kind of protection should already go in? And that has also developed the pre-marketing of the funds. And that means, in comparison to marketing, the provision of any documents which do not allow an investor to actually be able to invest, but rather is to test the appetite for the structure itself, which is also a regulated activity in Europe. And so always you have to be a little bit careful that you don't fall within pre-marketing without having your notifications made. Something which I think we've traditionally seen on the market is as well reverse solicitation. And in layman's terms, it just means essentially that the investor comes to the asset manager to inquire about the structure. So instead of the asset manager going to them and providing documents, they come in through a request process. And since the cross-border distribution framework, we don't really see this as prevalent anymore in Europe. However, it is an important topic and it is a question that we get very often. So it's interesting to see how the market develops in that sense as well. Now, I've done quite a bit of talking, so I think it's only fair to pass it over to Vincent to explain a little bit about the tax framework that we have in Luxembourg.
Thank you, Maria. I'll do a very brief overview of the Luxembourg fund tax system for investment funds, as it could be a topic for itself. Basically, we have a very friendly environment where investment funds pay no tax or almost no tax in Luxembourg. So we do a distinction between, on one part, product law, as Maria explained, and those investment funds which are not subject to product law. So if you have on the left-hand side of this slide, UCITS, Part 2 uses, CCAR, SIFs, and RIFE, which are subject to a product law, and that product law contains a tax regime applicable to those funds. Generally, all those funds, except for the CCARs, are exempted from corporate income tax, and are only subject to subscription tax or a reduced subscription tax, or sometimes even exempted from subscription tax. Basically, and for CCAR, we have another regime which, in the end, you have a tax-neutral vehicle, but they are subject to taxation, even though they have an exemption on the income from qualifying securities invested in risk capital, which means that basically, theoretically, they are subject to tax, but as they invest in venture capital, all their income is exempted. And then on the other side, we have the unregulated AIFs, which, I mean, the AIFM law in Luxembourg does not contain a specific tax regime. However, as those vehicles are usually tax transparent partnerships, they do not or they are not subject to income tax in Luxembourg. So basically, very tax neutral vehicles, and for so some of them, they are subject to a subscription tax that varies. Basically, it's 0.01% except for usage, where it goes up to 0.05% with some exemptions and reductions. Basically, for all the investment funds in Luxembourg, we do not have any withholding tax on distributions or any kind of payments that are made to investors. So basically, if the profit repatriation occurs without any Luxembourg withholding tax, and basically foreign investor, they will never be subject to taxation in Luxembourg. As regards to treaty access, what you need to bear in mind is that we have a large network of tax treaties, and treaty access is only granted to Luxembourg investment funds, which are incorporated as tax opaque vehicles, and treaty access is only granted in certain jurisdictions. I believe that with Canada, the treaty is not applicable. So it's really a case by case analysis. And also you have a VAT exemption on all the management services. So basically fund managers that provide fund management services will not be required to charge VAT on those services. So it's basically a summary of all the rules that are applicable to investment funds. Obviously, it's a bit synthesized, but yeah, you can. I think the most important part is to understand that you don't have that investment funds do not pay taxes in Luxembourg. And here's a very short summary of the different rules that we've just explained. So that's basically it for the tax aspect. Okay, I mean, we could do a bigger presentation of all those topics, but I think this is sufficient for an overview.
I always love hearing about tax. So a few numbers on Canada. So why am I here? Other than, of course, to visit our very nice office, well located. It's really because Canada is quite interesting for us, especially from an investor perspective. So what we see a lot in Luxembourg is Canadian investors and a lot of pension plans that are actually investing in Luxembourgish structures. So for us, it's very important to have that conversation about how do they feel about the entering into the European market? Is there anything that can be done better? How are the structures geared towards them? And how can we essentially help service our clients? And on the other hand, as well, of course, there's a lot of Luxembourgish vehicles that have access to, let's say, Canadian assets. So, of course, it's always a very interesting conversation to discuss. Do you have any questions about the tax structuring of that, the upstreams, the downstreams of cash through these types of vehicles, and how can we essentially assist you from a regulatory end to understand how that works, or from a corporate end, or from a banking end, or from a tax end? So, Greg, I don't know if there's anything that you've seen on the market that you might find interesting to discuss now, but I'm always all ears.
Sure. So, I mean, as you point out, the European ecosystem is an attractive platform for Canadian professional investors or institutional investors, in part because a lot of those pension plans have, the long-term outlook and the long-term stability requirements that, typically pension plans and private equity funds require. So private equity funds being the same most of the time, they're somewhere between 6, 7, 10-year horizon, and pension plans are often longer. So they don't have the luxury of, as some other funds might have, of kind of structuring through a jurisdiction and then, if it doesn't work out 2 or 3 years later, winding it up, because it's an expensive exercise for them. So we tend to see here in Canada with, I think the last statistics I saw was that 3 of our pension plans were in the top 10 private equity investors in the world. So we tend to see these pension plans looking around the world to see where they can how they can structure these investments and where they can place them. And of course, as I said, Europe tends to come back to the top of that list. So I'm not surprised to see that there's so much interest over there in structuring these things. You do see, as you'll probably experience when you're dealing with these institutions when they come to Europe, people outside of Canada, like most countries, you think of it as a big homogenous sort of jurisdiction, which is, partly true, but when it comes to many things, but in particular investments, private equity, and the way our pension plans are managed, they tend to take a different approach to things with, the main centers being highlighted on the map here with Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec being probably the biggest dollar jurisdictions to originate from, and the investments coming out of those provinces, while international can sometimes be a little bit different. And so it's an interesting place to be in terms of the markets here. So we obviously see a slightly different version of the funds market here in Canada than you have, other than the part where that money goes outside of the country. And so that's when we get to work with those institutional clients when they come up to the Luxembourg decision versus somewhere else. So yeah, it's an interesting market to be in. But as I said at the start, there's a reason that Luxembourg keeps coming, kind of floating to the top of it's either first, second, or third in the list of jurisdictions that we get asked about. And in part from the Canadian end of things, that's in part because of the comfort level that we have with Luxembourg and Europe generally. So I'm not surprised to see these numbers.
It's always good for us to hear. And I will do just a little bit of marketing to justify my trip. So in terms of investment funds, we have a small but growing team. We've been really working hard at developing the investment funds in Luxembourg along with the Global Investment Funds Group. So we have a strong offering in terms of different types of alternative investment funds. I would say around 70% of our work is on the structuring end, with the remaining 30% being on the regulatory end, which really focuses on, let's say, all of the different vehicles that work with the fund structures. So that means the managers themselves, any kind of authorization processes with the CSSF, etc. And we have a very strong tax team, which I let Vincent introduce.
Thank you. Basically, we have 7 people in the tax team. We have 1 partner, 2 counsel, and 4 associates. What we do is twofold. First, we do tax advice. So basically, we advise all the private equitors, fund managers on the structuring of their structures and investment platforms. And on the other side, we have also a strong tax compliance team. So we help preparing tax returns, tax filings, etc. And we also do a little bit of litigation, which is basically not very important for for investment funds here. So basically, the 2 aspects, so we can basically cover all the aspects in the life of a fund, from its initiation to the exits, basically.
So that's not too bad either.
Sorry, we didn't hear you.
Sorry, I said we cover 6 languages with the 2 teams. So that's great as well, and that really helps us be able to speak to different clients in their own native tongue. And I think that's it from our end. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity, Greg, to present a little bit of what we're doing in Luxembourg and to have access to some clients here as well.
Well, no, I mean, we had the easy part. We were here and then you made the trip over here. And so thank you to both of you for participating today. I mean, this is, as you guys know, this is how we spend a large part of our time comparing notes across jurisdictions. And I used the word at the phrase at the beginning about from the global conference about comparing client solutions. It's an important part of being able to offer clients access to what is happening in other places around the world so that they consider whether or not that's a good fit for them. So None of that would be possible if we didn't have the chance to sit down and go through these things together. So thank you for all of that. I mean, as it goes without saying that, you know, these are obviously complex topics that usually require a lot of thought and customization when you're developing these structures. But not only are we able to provide that structuring advice on the back end, as Vincent pointed out, you know, we're able to guide the clients through the outcomes. So once the structures are in place and you have to live with them, there's often things that have to be dealt with on the back end. So we spend a lot of time coordinating that stuff as well. So and of course, people will know how to reach out to either one of you if they have any questions. And we're always delighted to answer any follow-up questions as well. So thank you to those that connected to share a few minutes with us today and hear about our Luxembourg structuring options. And I think with the last closing remark, we will say safe travels home to Maria, and we look forward to hearing from all of you again. Thanks very much.